I chose to camp alone in the summer of 2014, somewhere deep inside the Bridger National Forest in western Wyoming. I was 28 then, old enough to feel confident outdoors, but still young enough to take stupid risks without thinking much about them. I liked long drives, empty roads, and the feeling of being far away from anything that reminded me of city noise. The plan was simple: hike about 8 miles into a quiet valley, set up a small camp near a stream, fish a little, sleep, and then move further the next morning. I had done trips like that before, but something about this one already felt heavier before I even left the trailhead, like I was carrying more weight in my chest than in my pack. The forest air was warm but dry, and the sky had that pale summer color where the sun hangs stubbornly, refusing to soften. I walked for a few hours without seeing anyone. The trails there weren't very popular on weekdays, which was exactly why I picked them. I liked silence, the type where you can hear insects tapping against leaves and the distant creaking of trees rubbing against one another. Everything felt slow and simple. I reached a clearing around mid-afternoon. It wasn't big, just a flat pocket of ground between pine trees with a faint animal path leading toward a thin stream. The water wasn't deep, only about ankle height, but it moved fast enough to stay clean. The sound of it rolling over the stones filled the whole clearing, almost like a quiet wall of noise. I set my pack down and felt the kind of relief that goes straight down your spine. I pitched my tent, which was small and meant for one person. It barely fit me and my gear, but I didn't need much. I unrolled my sleeping bag, checked that my food was sealed, and hung the extra bag up in a tree using a rope so nothing could climb into it during the night. The sun was still high, but the temperature dropped a little under the pines, giving the air a cooler edge. Felt good. I took a short walk down the stream, stepping on rocks and watching the way the water bent around them. There were small fish flicking their tails under the shadows. Everything looked untouched and calm. I kept walking until the stream dipped between two sloping edges of earth and disappeared into thicker woods. I stopped there because the trees were packed too tight and the ground was uneven. Something about that section felt off, like the forest was trying to hide whatever was beyond it. I turned around and walked back. By the time I returned to my campsite, the light had changed. It was still bright, but the shadows were longer, reaching across the ground like thin fingers. I didn't think much of it. I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire. I ate, cleaned up, and watched the flames twist. The forest softened around the edges as evening settled. The air cooled more quickly than I expected. The fire crackled steadily, and every once in a while, I heard soft rustling somewhere out beyond the trees. Nothing strange, just normal forest sounds, like squirrels or birds dropping into thicker branches. When the sky finally dimmed into a dull blue, I noticed something that bothered me a little. The forest had become too quiet. The running water from the stream still made its noise, but everything else, the bugs, the birds, even the wind, seemed to fall still. I sat there by the fire and tried to tell myself it was just the temperature changing. It sometimes happens before nighttime. Still, something about the silence felt sharp, like it was pointed at me. I stayed outside until the fire began to shrink. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt tired in that heavy-limbed way that comes after long hikes. I zipped the tent door shut, laid down, and listened to the muffled sound of my heartbeat settling. The forest outside seemed frozen. I tried to fall asleep, but I didn't. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, like my body felt something before my mind caught up. I didn't know what time it was, but the darkness inside the tent felt thick. I could barely make out the shape of my backpack near my feet. My ears picked up the faint gurgle of the stream outside, but nothing else. Then I heard something. It was soft at first, as if something brushed lightly over the pine needles. Not walking, more like dragging, a slow, uneven movement circling the clearing. The steps, if they were even steps, were too heavy for a small animal. They weren't the quick taps of a deer either. These sounded deliberate, slow, careful, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying not to be heard but failing just enough for me to notice. I stayed still, breathing shallowly. My sleeping bag felt tight around me, like it was holding me down. The sound moved again, closer this time, crunching lightly over the dried needles. I could almost picture something moving just outside the thin fabric of my tent, only a few feet away. The thought sent a cold shiver over my skin. The movement circled part of the clearing, paused, then circled again. It wasn't random, not like an animal stumbling around. It felt like something was checking the area, maybe even checking me. I wanted to tell myself it was a large deer or an elk, but the steps were too slow, too controlled. They didn't wander, they traced around my campsite like a pattern. I stayed awake for what felt like an hour, listening to the rustling fade and return in unpredictable waves. Sometimes it stopped completely, long enough for me to think it was gone. Then it would start again from a different direction. I didn't dare sit up. I didn't dare shift in my sleeping bag. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for sunrise. At some point, exhaustion overpowered fear, and I drifted into a shallow half-sleep filled with flashes of movement and dark shapes I hoped weren't real. When I opened my eyes again, the tent was filled with pale morning light. I took a long breath, unsure if I had imagined everything. But when I stepped outside, I realized I hadn't. There were prints in the dirt. Not shoe prints, just odd impressions, long and narrow, with a flat edge on one side, almost like part of a boot had pressed down but the rest didn't leave a mark. They were spaced strangely far apart, as if whatever made them had an awkward stride. The impressions circled my entire campsite. Some came within 3 feet of my tent. My stomach tightened. I followed one trail of prints until they reached the stream. The water had washed away the rest. I checked the food bag I had hung in the tree. It was untouched. Nothing in my gear was moved. That almost made it worse. Whoever had been there didn't want my food. They didn't want my things. They only walked around me while I slept. I packed quickly. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even bother folding my tent neatly. I just stuffed it into my pack. My hands shook slightly. The sunlight felt wrong, like it was too bright compared to what I felt inside. When I started hiking back toward the trailhead, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every sound, the click of branches settling, the flutter of a bird taking off, made my pulse jump. I kept imagining the night noises behind me, replaying them over and over until they didn't feel like sounds anymore but warnings. The hike back took half the time it took going in. I moved fast, almost jogging in some parts. When I finally reached the parking lot, my truck looked like the safest thing I had ever seen. I threw my pack in the back and drove without even brushing dirt off my boots. Only when I reached the nearest small town did I let myself stop. I sat in a gas station lot with the engine off, breathing deeply. The world looked normal again. Cars, people, sunlight. But my mind kept replaying the slow, circling footsteps around my tent. I never figured out who or what had been out there. The prints didn't match anything I recognized. Maybe it was a person wandering through the woods at night, but that somehow felt worse than any animal explanation. I still camp, but never alone anymore. And whenever I hear the forest grow too quiet at night, I feel that same cold shiver crawling along my skin, reminding me of that night in Wyoming. The fear wasn't the dark or the forest itself. It was knowing that something had stood only a few feet away from me, moving slowly around my tent while I was trapped inside, pretending not to breathe. And the worst part was that it never touched anything. It didn't try to break into my tent. It didn't steal. It simply watched, walked its slow circle, and then faded into the woods before sunrise, as if it wasn't done with me, just patient, waiting for someone like me to sleep in the wrong place again. I never liked camping alone, but in late September of 2018, I decided to push myself a little and spend 2 nights in a quiet forest in northern Michigan. I was 26 at the time, living a pretty normal life, and I felt like I was starting to get stuck in a slow routine. I had a week off work and thought maybe a small solo trip would help clear my head. The place I picked wasn't some famous park or anything. It was a quiet patch of land with a small public trail, about 2 miles away from the nearest road. I had been there once with friends years before, and I remembered it being peaceful, with tall dark pines that blocked the wind and a small creek that ran behind a hill. I got there in the late afternoon, parked my car near the old dirt pull-off, and walked in with my pack. The air felt cold already, which was normal for the season, but the silence felt heavier than I remembered. I could hear only small things, birds shifting on branches, the soft sound of my boots pressing down on dried needles, and the distant trickle of water. Felt nice at first. The forest always had a way of slowing down my thoughts. I reached the clearing I wanted just as the sky started turning orange. It wasn't large, just a flat open patch of dirt and grass with a ring of stones from old campfires. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, hung my small lantern on a branch, and collected some dry sticks to get a fire going. The cold sank in deep as soon as the sun dipped behind the trees, but the fire helped. I heated a simple meal, ate slowly, and listened to the forest settle into its night rhythm. I didn't hear anything strange. No warnings. Nothing that would have made me leave. It was just a normal quiet night. It wasn't until around midnight that something shifted. I was lying in my sleeping bag, half asleep, staring at the thin fabric of the tent ceiling as the fire outside lowered into soft orange embers. The forest was dead silent. Too silent, in a way that didn't fit the usual night sounds. No wind, no crickets, no rustling. It felt almost like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried to fall asleep anyway, but my body felt tense for no clear reason. A strange sense of awareness sat heavy in my chest, like something had changed outside and I didn't know what. Then I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost too faint to notice, like someone stepping on a patch of needles far away. A soft, crisp crunch. I told myself it was probably a deer. There were always deer around those forests, but something about the weight of the step felt wrong. It wasn't the quick, light sound a deer makes. It was slow, heavy, almost deliberate. I stayed still and kept listening. Another step, then another. My heartbeat got loud enough that I could feel it in my throat. The steps weren't coming from the trail. They were coming from deep inside the trees, somewhere behind where I set up camp. The direction of the creek. The steps stopped for a few seconds. Then came the sound of something brushing against a tree trunk, like a coat or a large bag scraping against rough bark. I felt that sudden cold rush of fear that starts in your stomach and works its way outward. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I lay there in the tent, staring straight up, holding my breath. After a minute, I forced myself to slowly slide my hand toward my backpack inside the tent. I kept a small flashlight in it. I didn't turn it on. I just wanted to know I had it. My fingers shook a little as I wrapped them around it. The sound came again, this time closer. Another slow step, but now on soil instead of needles. Then another. Whatever it was had moved out of the trees and onto the clearing, onto the open ground where I had pitched the tent. I could feel the vibration in the dirt as it stepped. It wasn't strong, but it was enough for me to sense it. I felt frozen. Every tiny noise inside the tent felt loud. My breath, the shifting of my clothes, the faint movement of the sleeping bag fabric. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could, taking small, controlled breaths. The thing outside stopped moving. I could tell it was only a few feet from my tent. I didn't know whether it was facing me, or standing sideways or crouched or anything. I didn't even want to imagine it. I just stared at the bottom of the tent where the firelight should have been shining through from the dying embers. But the light was blocked. Something large was standing between my tent and the fire. For a moment, I wondered if it was a hiker or someone who got lost. But the hour was too late, and no one hikes that deep into the forest at night. And if it had been a person who needed help, they would have called out. They wouldn't just walk slowly into someone's camp in the dark. A new sound came, soft but disturbingly close. It was the sound of careful breathing. Slow, controlled, almost like someone trying to stay quiet. That chilled me deeper than anything else. Animals breathe fast. Animals huff. This sounded too steady. I forced myself to lie completely still. I didn't know how long the thing stood there. Felt like minutes. It might have been less, but every second felt stretched out. Then I heard movement again, a slow shift of weight, the sound of the fire crackling a little louder as the shape blocking it moved away. I saw the faint glow of the embers return through the tent fabric. Whatever had been standing outside was walking past the tent now, heading toward the far edge of the clearing. The steps were slow, not rushed, not frightened, just steady. When the steps finally reached the tree line, they stopped again. And for a long moment there was nothing, just dead silence. Then, without warning, the sound of fast footsteps tore through the darkness. Sharp, heavy running steps heading deeper into the forest. They got quieter and quieter until they faded completely. I stayed awake until the first light of morning. I didn't move until the sky turned pale blue. When I finally opened the tent and stepped outside, the cold morning air hit my face and I felt my legs trembling. The clearing looked normal at first until I saw it. In the soft dirt around the fire pit were marks, footprints. Not animal prints. They were clearly human. Large, deep, and spaced in a way that showed slow, deliberate movements. They circled halfway around my tent, then continued toward the trees where the steps had vanished in the night. But what bothered me most was that the prints came from the opposite direction of the main trail. They came from the dense brush behind the creek, where there were no paths at all. No one would walk through that mess unless they had a reason. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook the entire time, and I kept turning toward the trees, expecting to see someone watching. The forest was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. On my 2-mile walk out, the forest never warmed up. It stayed silent, heavy, and cold. I didn't slow down once. I kept imagining that whoever had been near my tent might still be out there, standing behind one of the trees, hidden just far enough that I couldn't see them. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat there with my hands on the wheel, breathing hard. I didn't start the engine for a full minute. I just stared at the trail entrance, trying to understand what had happened. There was nothing supernatural about the night. No ghosts, no creatures. What scared me was how real it was. A real person had walked into my camp in the middle of the night, stood inches from where I slept, and watched silently. No reason. No explanation. No sign they needed help. Just watching. I drove away and didn't look back. I never went camping alone again, and I don't plan to. The forest still feels beautiful to me, but that night reminded me how little control you have when you're out there, how easy it is for someone to step between the trees without warning, how close danger can be without making a sound. To this day, the part that sticks with me the most is not the footsteps, or the breathing, or the silence. It's the simple fact that whoever it was didn't do anything. They didn't attack. They didn't speak. They didn't make any move to show their intent. They just stood there, in the darkness, watching me sleep. And I will never know why. I went camping alone in the late autumn of 2016, somewhere in the Northumberland countryside in England. I was 23 at the time and still at that age where I felt like I had to prove to myself that I wasn't scared of simple things like being alone in the woods. I had just bought a small used tent and a cheap sleeping bag, and the first weekend I got off from work, I drove out toward a quiet walking trail that I had only seen once before. It wasn't an official campsite, but the area was open and people sometimes camped near the fields behind an old stone wall. I liked the idea of being away from everyone for a night. The weather was colder than I expected. The wind pushed through the tall grass and moved it in slow waves. The sky was a washed-out gray that made the whole place look older than it really was. I parked my car beside a metal gate, grabbed my backpack, and walked farther into the field until I couldn't see the road anymore. The ground was soft and uneven, and the wet grass pressed against my boots as I searched for a spot flat enough for the tent. When I finally found one, the place was silent except for the wind and the occasional thud of distant farm equipment on the other side of the hills. I set up the tent slowly, trying to do it right even though my hands were stiff from the cold. I kept glancing around while I worked, not because I was scared yet, but because the open land felt too wide. There were no trees near me, just bushes in clusters and an old wooden fence that looked like it had been breaking apart for decades. Beyond it was a small patch of woodland, dark even though it was still early afternoon. When I finished setting up, I placed my sleeping bag inside, arranged my food, and sat outside for a while. The afternoon dragged, but I liked the quiet. I walked a little along the fence, kicking stones, trying to shake off the feeling that the place looked abandoned in a way that wasn't normal. I told myself that I was being dramatic, that empty fields always felt like that. By early evening, the clouds had turned darker. The air smelled like damp soil and cold metal, the kind of smell that makes you brace yourself for rain even if it never comes. I cooked a small meal on a cheap camping stove and watched steam rise into the wind and vanish. The light faded faster than I expected, and by the time I crawled into the tent, the world outside had become a deep, heavy blue. I lay on my back inside the sleeping bag, listening to the wind push against the tent. The fabric shook a little, and the small metal poles clicked softly. The sound made it hard to relax. I wasn't exactly scared, but I felt strangely aware of every sound. The field had been so quiet earlier, but at night even the smallest things sounded bigger than they really were. Every small movement in the grass outside felt like something walking. I turned on a small torch and read for a while, but my eyes kept drifting to the tent door, as if expecting the fabric to move. Nothing happened, so eventually I turned off the light and closed my eyes. Sometime later, I woke up without knowing why. It must have been close to midnight because the darkness was thick and cold, and the wind had died down. The silence was sharp, almost unnatural, the type of silence where even your heartbeat feels too loud. I lay there still, trying to figure out what had woken me, and that was when I heard something. It was not loud. It was slow, a steady, deliberate crunch in the grass. Then another, and another. Something was moving outside my tent. I stopped breathing. My chest felt tight, and I pressed my hands against the sleeping bag to stop it from making noise. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the steps were too heavy, too slow, almost cautious. I could feel the cold air on my face through the small gap near the zipper. The footsteps came closer, stopping every few seconds as if whoever or whatever was listening. My mind raced in circles, telling me it was probably nothing, maybe just the wind, but there was no wind. The air outside was completely still. Then the footsteps stopped right beside the tent. I felt the ground shift slightly, as if someone was standing only inches from where my head was. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My whole body tensed. I could feel the faint vibration of weight on the soil. I stared at the ceiling of the tent even though I couldn't see anything. For several long seconds, there was no movement. The quiet was unbearable. Then I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Not mine. Not an animal's. A human. A grown man. I wanted to unzip the tent, run, scream, anything, but I was frozen. My thoughts felt like they were locked in one place, repeating the same message over and over. Someone is outside. Then something worse happened. The silhouette of a hand pressed lightly against the side of the tent. The fabric dipped inward by just a couple of inches, the way it would if someone was resting their fingertips against it. The pressure was careful, almost testing. I stared at it, numb, feeling my heart hammer so hard I thought the man outside might hear it. The hand stayed there for at least a full minute, maybe longer. Time felt stretched and twisted. Then, just as slowly as it appeared, the hand slid away. The footsteps started again, but this time they moved toward the woodland behind the fence. They were slow and dragging, as though the man didn't care if I heard him anymore. Eventually, the sound faded into the darkness, and I was left in my tent with a cold sweat covering my entire body. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed completely still, listening, waiting for the footsteps to return, but they never did. The silence stayed heavy until the sky finally started to lighten with the early morning. At sunrise, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, and my legs felt weak. The field looked exactly the same as it had the day before, calm and empty, but I couldn't shake the knowledge that someone had been there. When I walked around the tent, I saw the footprints. They weren't fresh enough to be obvious, but I could see where the grass had been pressed down in a rough path leading from the fence, stopping right next to my tent, and then leading back toward the trees. They were spaced like human steps, not animal tracks. I packed my things as fast as I could. My hands kept shaking, and I kept turning to look at the trees, expecting to see someone standing there watching. Nothing appeared, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the entire time. The walk back to the car felt longer than it should have. Each gust of wind made me turn around. Each rustle of grass made me think the man had followed me. When I finally reached the car, I threw everything inside without caring how it landed and locked the doors the second I sat down. As I drove away, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the field and walking toward the road. But all I saw was the empty countryside behind me, the land wide and silent and unchanged. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering if the man had been watching me long before I heard him, wondering how long he had stood in the dark, just a few feet away, breathing softly through the still air. I try not to imagine what he wanted or why he came so close. I just remind myself of the same thing every time the memory hits me. I was lucky he walked away, and that is the clearest ending I can give. There was no mystery, no supernatural reason, just a real man out there in the dark, creeping close to a tent in the middle of the night, and I will never know what he had planned. But I know what I felt, I know what I heard, and I know for certain that someone was there. I had been planning the trip for months, a hunting and camping expedition deep in the northern forests of Minnesota, around the Chippewa National Forest. It was October of 2013, and I was 24, freshly out of college and eager for a stretch of quiet alone in the woods. I had spent the better part of the spring and summer preparing my gear, checking rifles, stocking ammunition, packing freeze-dried meals, and making sure my sleeping bag could withstand the near-freezing nights that were common in that region this time of year. My goal was simple: spend a week away from the city, practice hunting, and reconnect with something primal I felt slipping from my life. I drove for hours in my old Ford pickup, following a narrow gravel road that wound between thick stands of pine and birch until I reached a small clearing beside a creek. There were no other vehicles, no tents, no signs of human life beyond a couple of faded deer carcass tags nailed to a post near what must have been an old campsite. I parked and stepped out, inhaling the crisp fall air. The smell of wet earth and pine needles was intoxicating, and for a moment, I just stood there, listening to the distant hum of the creek and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I set up camp near the creek, choosing a flat patch of ground partially shielded by a cluster of trees. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and arranged my gear meticulously. Everything had its place. Once the camp was ready, I checked my rifle, loaded it, and secured it safely against a nearby tree, just as I had practiced countless times before. By the time the sun was low in the sky, I had a small fire going, enough to warm my hands and cook some of the freeze-dried stew I'd brought. Smoke curled up through the trees, catching the last gold rays of sunlight. That night, I slept in fitful spurts, waking now and then to the soft sounds of wildlife. The forest was alive in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I could hear the distant snap of twigs, the occasional bird settling into its roost, and a low, unplaceable rustle that kept my senses alert. I tried to tell myself it was just deer or raccoons, but the sound had a weight to it, as if something was moving deliberately, watching and waiting. I woke at first light, the orange glow filtering through the mist that hung low over the creek. I ate a small breakfast and headed out with my rifle slung over my shoulder, walking carefully through the dense undergrowth. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, muffling my steps, but I moved slowly and deliberately. I spotted deer tracks, fresh, heading toward a denser part of the woods. I followed them for hours, scanning constantly, breathing in rhythm with the forest. Hunting required patience, and I had learned the value of stillness. By midday, I had stalked a young buck close enough to take a clean shot, and I did. The deer went down almost instantly, and I approached it cautiously, heart still pounding. I felt a strange mix of triumph and responsibility. I field-dressed the animal with care, noting every cut and movement, packing the meat back to my campsite. The wait was significant, and the walk back along the creek took longer than I anticipated. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping low, and a cold wind had begun to rise. I stacked firewood, cleaned my rifle again, and prepared the deer for transport the next day. That night, as I sat by the fire eating a simple meal, I became aware of something odd. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from the direction opposite the creek. At first, I thought it was the deer or raccoon scavenging, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy to belong to an animal. I froze, listening. The sounds circled my camp slowly, never getting closer but never moving away either. My rifle was within reach, and I gripped it, trying to steady my breathing. The forest felt dense, almost claustrophobic, with the shadows of the trees stretching unnaturally in the firelight. Hours passed, and the sounds eventually faded, replaced by the distant howl of a wolf or coyote. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario. Someone could be out there watching, waiting. The thought gnawed at me, a raw, primal fear I hadn't expected in a place I thought I knew so well. Morning came with a thin mist hanging over the creek. I packed the deer meat carefully and prepared to leave the campsite, deciding that I needed to hike out early before anyone, or anything, had a chance to surprise me. The forest had shifted overnight. I noticed broken branches that hadn't been there before, footprints that weren't mine, and the unmistakable smell of a fire smoldering nearby, even though no one had set one I could see. The reality hit me. I wasn't alone. Not for a second. Someone had been near my camp while I slept, close enough to circle it without being seen. I moved fast but cautiously, keeping my eyes on every movement in the trees. My senses sharpened to a painful clarity. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound was magnified. I hiked along a ridge that would eventually lead me to a main trail. The deer meat slowed me down, but I couldn't abandon it. Years of hunting had taught me respect for the animals I took. As I crested a hill, I finally saw signs of human presence. Tire tracks in the mud, a distant road that would lead back to civilization. Relief washed over me, though I remained alert until I reached my truck. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following. The woods on either side seemed impossibly dense, the mist from the creek clinging stubbornly to the trees. I finally made it to a small town an hour later, stopping at a diner to eat something real and hot. I noticed a few locals watching me curiously, but I didn't speak to anyone. I just wanted warmth, light, and to feel safe again. Back home, I unpacked my gear, cleaned my rifle thoroughly, and put the deer meat into my freezer. I reported the campsite intrusion to the forest rangers, describing everything I had noticed: the footsteps, the broken branches, the smoldering fire. They told me such occurrences were rare but not unheard of, and advised me to always be cautious, even in seemingly empty parts of the forest. That night, I slept soundly in my own bed, with locks on doors and the city lights outside my window. The whole experience stayed with me. I realized that the forest, no matter how familiar, was unpredictable. Animals, humans, weather, it all mattered. That trip taught me vigilance, respect, and the fragility of solitude. I still hunt, still camp, but I carry more caution with me now. I make sure someone knows exactly where I am. I check my surroundings constantly, and I never underestimate the quiet presence of another human in the woods. Years later, when I think back to that week in Minnesota, it's not just about the deer or the fire or the footsteps. It's about the raw, immediate clarity of being alive and aware. The forest was beautiful, unforgiving, and strangely honest in a way cities never are. And I survived it all. Not by luck, but by paying attention, respecting the rules, and trusting my instincts, even when fear wanted me to freeze. That's the lesson I carry into every hunt, every camping trip, every moment I step into the wild. I never liked camping alone, but in the summer of 2019, after turning 24, something in me wanted to try it once, just to see what it felt like to be completely away from everything. I had been stressed from work, exhausted most days, barely sleeping at night, and I felt like I needed a break from everything familiar. So I picked a quiet national forest area in northern Alberta, Canada, a place I had never visited before but had heard was peaceful, wide, and full of thick pine trees that blocked out the sight of roads and houses. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to hear nothing except the wind and maybe the sound of some birds. I thought that would help clear my mind. I planned the trip for late August, when the nights were just starting to get cold but the days were still warm enough to walk around in a t-shirt. The drive to the forest took almost 5 hours. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, turning the sky into a soft orange color that stretched across the tops of the trees. The gravel road leading into the woods felt endless, and as soon as I passed the last small cabin, the world became silent in a way that felt like pressure on my ears. I found a pull-off spot beside an old dirt clearing that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no fire pits, no signs, no marks of people. The dirt was packed down but covered in pine needles, and the tree line around the clearing was so thick it looked like a solid wall. I liked that. It felt like I had picked a place where nobody would come walking through by accident. After setting up my tent, unpacking my small cooler, and gathering some dry sticks for a fire later, I walked around the clearing to get a feel of the place. The forest floor was uneven, soft in some places, almost spongy with old moss and rotting wood. The air smelled sharp, like cold tree sap and dry bark. The deeper I looked into the woods, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. I tried not to think about animals watching me from those shadows, even though the thought came naturally. When I finally started a small fire and sat by it, The feeling of being alone truly settled in. The kind of quiet you don't hear in towns or cities. No cars, no distant hum of phones, no footsteps except my own. I could hear my heartbeat when I stayed still. It was peaceful, but it also made every small noise seem sharper. When a branch cracked somewhere far behind my tent, I turned my head so fast I felt a pinch in my neck. It was probably just the wood cooling or an animal stepping somewhere. But in a place that quiet, every little sound felt louder than it should have. As night fully fell, the darkness around me thickened. My fire lit only a small circle of the clearing. Everything outside that circle blended into one heavy, endless dark. I kept glancing at the trees even though I tried to stop myself. My brain kept imagining shapes, even though there were none. I went to sleep earlier than usual because I didn't want to sit alone in the dark too long. The fire was already fading, and the cold was creeping in. Inside the tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I tried to calm myself by listening to the wind pushing through the branches. For a while, it worked. My mind slowed down, but at some point in the night, the wind stopped completely, and that silence woke me up. I didn't know what time it was. The tent was pitch black. At first, I thought the silence was normal night quiet, but then I noticed something else. The forest was still too still. No crickets, no rustling, no owl sounds, just nothing. It felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard something, a soft crunch, like a footstep pressing into dry needles. Slow, heavy, controlled, came from the tree line to my left. Not fast, not rushed, just one step. Then a pause, then another step. My whole body froze. I tried to breathe quietly, but I could hear my breath shaking. I told myself it could be a moose or a deer, something normal, something that would wander off if it didn't smell food. But the steps were too careful. Not the way an animal walked. It sounded like something trying not to be noticed. The steps moved slightly, just enough for me to feel like whatever it was had changed direction. Still slow, still heavy, still deliberate. I lay there with my eyes open even though I couldn't see anything. The tent felt thinner than paper. I felt every sound in my chest. After a few minutes that passed painfully slowly, the steps stopped completely. I waited for more, but there was nothing, just the suffocating quiet again. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed still, afraid that any movement would make noise. My mind kept imagining someone standing just outside the tent, listening the same way I was listening. When the sky finally lightened and morning came, I felt my body relax for the first time in hours. I stepped outside the tent carefully. The clearing looked normal again, with sunlight hitting the trees and warming the ground. Nothing seemed disturbed. I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything until I walked toward the edge of the clearing. There were footprints, not boots, not animal tracks, bare human footprints, deep, clear, pressed into the dirt and pine needles. They came from between the trees and stopped about 30 feet from my tent. The footprints were larger than mine, wider, like someone with rough, heavy feet had been standing there in the dark. The strangest part was that they didn't turn back. There were no footprints leading away, just the ones leading toward the clearing. Nothing else. It felt like the forest suddenly caught its breath again. Birds started making noise in the branches overhead, but none of that calmed the cold weight growing in my chest. I packed up slowly because my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every few minutes I looked back at the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close, watching from a place where the light didn't reach. Before leaving, I walked one more time around the clearing to make sure I hadn't mistaken the prints. They were still there, still deep, still pointed straight toward where I had been sleeping. I walked to my car fast, but not fast enough to look panicked. I didn't want to make noise. As soon as I got inside and locked the doors, I felt a strange mix of safety and fear. like I had put a thin layer between me and whatever had been here last night, but not enough to really stop anything if it wanted to come near. The dirt road out seemed longer than before. Every shadow between the trees looked like it could hide a person. Every bump in the road made my heart jump. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over because my hands were shaking too much to keep driving. I sat there for 10 minutes before starting the car again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened when I got home. I didn't know what to say. There was no proof except those footprints, and I kept thinking that even if I told someone, they would assume it was just a hiker, a homeless person, someone passing by the woods. But bare feet in northern Alberta, in cold August nights, walking silently in the pitch dark toward an isolated tent. Weeks passed, then months, and I tried to forget it. But sometimes, late at night, I remember the silence, the careful steps, and the way the footprints only went one direction. I haven't gone camping alone since. I don't think I ever will again, because whatever was walking around my tent that night wasn't lost. It wasn't wandering. It wasn't confused. It knew exactly where I was sleeping, and it walked straight toward me, slow and quiet, like it was trying not to wake me until it was close enough to see inside. And the worst part, the part one can't shake, is that I still don't know why it stopped, or if it planned to come back. I went camping in northern Utah in late September of 2019. I was 26 then, still doing seasonal jobs and taking long trips into the mountains whenever I could. I liked to disappear for a few days at a time, shut off my phone, and just walk. I'd camped alone many times before, so I didn't think twice when I parked my old SUV along a dirt road about 2 hours south of Bear Lake and hiked into the forest. The air felt cold already, the kind that sneaks into your sleeves no matter how many layers you wear. But the sky was clear and everything smelled like pine sap and dry leaves. The plan was simple. 2 nights out, try a new trail, maybe photograph some deer. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, stove, a can of bear spray, and my camera. I took a narrow trail that cut away from the road and dipped into low hills. There were no other cars parked nearby, and I didn't see anyone else on the trail. I liked the quiet. It made the footsteps on dirt and the wind in the branches feel louder, almost like the woods spoke in slow breaths. By late afternoon, I reached a flat patch of ground near a shallow stream. The stream wasn't strong enough to be loud, but it made a soft trickling sound that mixed with the wind. There were old trees around the site, thick trunks, bark peeling, branches hanging low like bent arms. Everything felt still. I set up my tent, boiled water, ate pasta from a pouch, and watched the light fade through the trees. At around 8, I crawled into my tent and listened to the stream while I dozed off. Sometime in the night, I woke up without knowing why. It wasn't the kind of waking where you roll over and fall asleep again. It felt like my body pulled me out of a dream because something outside wasn't right. I lay flat on my back and listened hard. The woods were silent, which was strange because even at night there's usually some sound. An owl, a branch creaking, water, wind. But it was dead quiet. My ears kept reaching for something and found nothing. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, dragging steps, not the light tapping of a deer or the hurried scramble of a raccoon. They sounded like a person walking barefoot on leaves, but heavier and uneven. One step, then a long pause, then another step, like whoever it was couldn't decide where to go. I held my breath and waited, hoping the steps would move away from my tent, but they didn't. They stayed in the same area, circling, no more than 5 or 6 yards from me. I didn't have my phone on because I turned it off earlier to save battery, and I didn't want to make noise by trying to reach for it. I just stayed very still and listened. The steps scraped along the ground, then stopped again. I could hear breathing, slow, deep, and too close. It didn't sound like an animal sniffing. It sounded like someone trying to control their breath, like they were listening too. I stayed awake until the steps finally faded back into the trees. Even when I couldn't hear them anymore, I didn't sleep until the sky turned gray. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent and scanned the area. The ground was covered with dry leaves and pine needles, but I could see places where something had disturbed them. There were faint prints, not clear footprints, but patches where the leaves were brushed aside in long streaks. I told myself it must have been an animal dragging its feet. Maybe a deer with an injured leg. Maybe I was overreacting because it was dark. I tried to shake it off and went on a short hike up a nearby ridge. The air was cold, but the sun felt warm. I took photos of the valley and spotted some elk far in the distance. For a while, things felt normal again. But when I got back to my camp around midday, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My tent flap, which I had zipped closed, was half unzipped. It wasn't pulled open wide, just a few inches, but enough that I knew I hadn't left it like that. Nothing inside seemed moved or missing, but the bag with my food had a small tear on one side, like someone had poked it with a finger or a stick. It wasn't chewed like an animal would do. It was just sliced open a little, deliberately. I didn't want to pack up early. I'd driven all the way out there and hiked this far, and I kept trying to tell myself I was imagining things. So I stayed for the second night, but I moved my tent a bit farther from the stream and closer to a fallen tree, thinking it would give me some cover. The second night started quiet. I lay inside the tent listening to the stream again, which was softer from this new spot, but still there. I tried to stay awake a little longer, thinking maybe it was better if I didn't drift off too soon. But after an hour or two, my eyes got heavy and I finally fell asleep. I woke up to something worse than footsteps. I woke up to breathing, not far away in the trees. Asterisk, asterisk, right next to my tent, asterisk, asterisk. It was directly behind the thin fabric near my head. Slow, heavy breaths, like someone crouching close, trying not to touch the tent. I froze instantly. My arms went numb from fear. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't swallow. The breathing got a little louder, then quieter, like the person was shifting position. Then something scraped along the side of the tent. Not claws, not paws, fingers. I could hear them tracing the fabric lightly, almost testing it. I felt the tiniest tug on the fabric near the zipper, like someone pinching it from the outside. For a moment, I thought maybe I should yell, make it clear I was awake. But something inside me told me not to make a sound. Whatever was outside didn't move like a normal person. It didn't breathe like someone hiking or camping. It breathed like someone pretending to be something else, someone holding themselves in a way people shouldn't. The breathing stopped. Then came the sound that haunts me the most when I think back on it. Asterisk, asterisk, a sound like an animal trying too hard to imitate a human step, asterisk, asterisk. A strange, high, awkward step, then a crouched shuffle, then another step, like a person who wasn't used to walking like a person. It moved slowly from one side of my tent to the other. I didn't dare reach for the zipper or the bear spray. I lay still for almost an hour while it wandered around the camp, circling in messy patterns. Every once in a while it made a small noise, something between a hum and a grunt, like it was practicing sounds it didn't know how to use. At some point, the noise faded into the trees. I didn't sleep again. When dawn finally came, I packed faster than I ever have in my life. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't bother to boil water or eat. I grabbed everything, shoved it into my pack, and left. On the way back to the car, I kept glancing behind me. Several times I thought I saw movement deeper in the trees. Something pale between the branches, something moving too slowly to be a deer, too smoothly to be a bear. But I didn't stop to check. When I reached my SUV, sweat was running down my back even though the air was cold. I started the engine and drove until I hit the main road. Only then did I stop and really breathe. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors. A week later, I read about a missing hiker reported only a few miles from where I'd camped. They'd gone missing months before I was out there, and the search teams had found nothing but scraps of clothing. The article said the area had steep hills and hidden ravines, and that an accident was the most likely explanation. But I remembered the torn food bag, the half-unzipped tent, the strange dragging steps, the breathing that didn't sound right, the way it paced around my camp like it was studying me. And I remembered the shape I thought I saw through the trees on my way out. Pale, thin, and too tall. I still tell myself it was just a person living out there. Someone unstable. Someone who'd been alone too long and forgotten how to act normal. That's the only explanation that makes sense. A human being can become something far more terrifying than any story if they're desperate and wild enough. I haven't camped alone since, and I don't go back to Utah. Whenever I think about those nights, I don't think about a creature or a spirit or anything supernatural. I think about the sound of those careful, controlled breaths right outside my tent, and how close I came to unzipping the door and finding out exactly what kind of person was waiting there. I never planned on stopping at that old abandoned campground. It wasn't even marked on the map I kept folded in the glove box, the same map I had been using since my early 20s when I first started hiking on my own. By the summer of 2014, I was 31 and thought I had enough experience to handle a simple weekend trip into the backcountry of northern Montana. The idea was to spend 2 nights out there alone, clear my head, breathe fresh air again, and come back feeling less worn out from work and life. I had packed my usual gear. My old canvas pack with frayed straps, a tent that smelled like years of pine needles, 2 knives, a small hatchet, a metal water bottle, and enough dried food to last longer than I would ever need. I left my phone in the truck once I parked, telling myself I didn't want any distractions. I followed a narrow trail that twisted between tall pines and spruce trees. The ground was soft and damp from the week's earlier rain, and every step sounded like it was being swallowed. I spent most of the afternoon walking, stopping only to take a drink or adjust the straps on my pack. Somehow I drifted farther from the labeled trails and ended up next to a faded sign half hidden under tall grass. The letters were peeling, but I could still make out the words Bear Creek Campground, though the paint was so cracked it looked like scratch marks. It wasn't on the map, and I had never heard anyone mention it, but the sun was sinking behind the trees and the air was starting to cool. I told myself an old campground meant easy space to set up, maybe even an old fire ring I could use, so I followed the beaten path that opened into a large clearing. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The fire rings were rusty piles of stones with black ash frozen inside them like they hadn't been touched in years. There were broken benches covered in moss, their wood splintering like soft bones. A small building, maybe an old supply shed, leaned to one side with its roof half caved in. Grass pushed through the cracks in the concrete floor. It felt strange to see something man-made fall apart so deeply, like nature had decided to erase all signs of whoever once camped here. But the field was open, and I was tired, so I set my tent near a cluster of trees at the edge where the ground was level and dry. As the evening settled in, the air grew colder. I gathered fallen branches from the forest floor and built a small fire. The flames cracked softly, warm but not too bright, and I sat beside them eating a bag of dried fruit. The silence was thick and heavy, almost pressing on my ears. Usually forests have some sort of life at dusk. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, something moving around. But here it felt like everything had decided to stay still. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was because the area wasn't used by people anymore. Animals might have learned to avoid it. When I finished eating, I walked the edges of the clearing just to get a sense of the area. The ground dipped behind the shed into a shallow slope that led to an old fire road. The trees along that slope were unusually thin, tall, and spaced out evenly like something had cleared the forest long ago. The deeper I looked, the darker the space between the trunks became. I didn't like staring into it, so I turned back toward camp. That was when I noticed the first set of footprints. They were in the dirt near the fire ring closest to the center of the clearing. At first, I didn't think much of them, thinking maybe they were my own from earlier when I walked around. But these prints were larger, deeper, and older. The edges were soft and rounded, like they had been there for weeks. They led toward the shed, then cut sharply toward the tree line before disappearing into the undergrowth. There were no prints coming back. It made me uneasy, but I told myself hunters sometimes used abandoned places like this. Maybe someone had passed through, checked the shed, and left. I went back to my fire and let the warmth push away the worry. As the sky turned from orange to a deep blue, I banked the fire and went into my tent. I pulled my sleeping bag around my shoulders, listening to the sounds outside, or rather, the lack of them. It was so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the fabric ceiling. Hours passed like that. I shifted from one side to the other, trying to get comfortable. At some point in the night, I heard a sound, light, sharp, and quick. It wasn't a branch falling or leaves rustling. It was footsteps. They were slow at first, almost measured, like someone trying to step carefully. They moved across the clearing, crunching the dry grass. I held my breath, waiting for them to fade or turn away, but they grew louder until it felt like they were right outside my tent. I swallowed hard, keeping still. The air felt thicker inside the tent, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. I could hear the footsteps circling, always at the same steady pace. Dirt shifted under each step, and once I thought I heard the faint sound of fabric brushing against rough wood, like someone leaned on one of the old benches. My entire body stayed frozen. The footsteps eventually faded toward the shed. I waited long after they stopped, refusing to leave the tent. I didn't sleep at all that night. When a thin line of morning light finally slipped through the tent fabric, I crawled out, stiff and shaken. The clearing looked the same at first glance. Quiet, empty. But then I saw the prints in the dew-covered grass. Fresh ones, still sharp around the edges. They circled my tent, just as I had heard, and then headed toward the shed. I followed them slowly, each step sending a chill up my arms. When I got to the shed door, I saw deep scratches across it, long and jagged, like someone dragged something metal or sharp against the wood. The prints stopped at the door, but the door was shut, wedged tightly. Something in me told me not to open it. I backed away, heart pounding, and returned to my camp. I tore down my tent faster than I ever had before. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into my pack. I kicked dirt over the remains of my fire, even though there was nothing left but cold ash. Then I hit the trail I had come from and didn't stop walking. I didn't look back at the clearing. I didn't check the map or try to find the exact point where I had gone off the trail. I walked until my legs burned and my shirt clung to my back. The forest around me felt normal again. Birds calling, insects humming, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even when I reached my truck, even when I started the engine, even when I drove the long dirt road back to the main highway, the sensation clung to me like a wet shadow. When I got home, I dropped my pack on the floor and sat on the couch, staring at nothing for a long time. I tried telling myself it was just a hiker passing through, someone who didn't want to be seen. But the prints circling my tent, the scratches on the shed door, the silence of that place, none of it fit a normal explanation. I never went back to that part of Montana. I marked the spot on my old map with a thick black X so I would always know to avoid it. And even now, years later, I still think about those footsteps at night. Not because I'm scared of whoever was out there, but because I know that campground wasn't empty. Someone had been using it long before I showed up. Someone who watched me the whole time. Someone who moved around camp in the dark with steady, patient steps, as if they were waiting for something. And the worst part is knowing I wasn't meant to find that place at all. But once I did, someone noticed, and they wanted me to know they were there. I had planned that camping trip for months, even though I never liked the idea of being alone in the woods during bad weather. But I wanted a break from work, from noise, from people. I wanted a week to myself in the quiet parts of northern Norway, far from the towns and the usual hiking paths. It was early September of 2022, and the days were already shorter up there. When I reached the small clearing I had marked on the map, the sky was still bright, but it felt heavy and swollen with rain. The air smelled like wet soil and pine, and the wind kept pushing the branches in slow, uneasy movements. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, which was surrounded on 3 sides by tall trees and thick undergrowth. The 4th side opened toward a long stretch of mossy ground leading down to a narrow river. I liked the spot because it felt hidden. I felt like nobody would walk past accidentally. The nearest cabin was several kilometers away, and the road I used to park my car was nothing more than an old dirt track that hunters sometimes used. I ate a simple meal, boiled water for tea, and pulled out a small notebook to write down the things I wanted to do during the week. Started to drizzle, light at first, but steady. I decided to turn in early since the clouds looked darker by the minute. A few hours after I got inside the tent, the rain grew stronger. The drops hit the fabric in a fast, constant beat that made it hard to relax. The wind arrived next, low at first, then rising in sudden pushes that bent the trees. I could hear branches shifting and leaves scraping against each other like dry sandpaper. I lay on my back, fully awake, staring at the faint shadow of the tent ceiling above me. My sleeping bag felt warm enough, but something about the night kept my mind alert. The smell of damp earth, the cold draft coming through the seams, the sense that the woods around me were changing with every gust. The hours moved slowly. I kept checking the time on my phone, but the signal was dead. I wasn't worried about that. It was normal for remote places. What bothered me was something else. It was the way the forest seemed to fall silent between the heavy stretches of rain. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence. It was tighter, tense, like everything was waiting. Every time the rain paused, I could hear faint things. Little snaps in the distance, soft thuds, the sound of something shifting weight on wet ground. I tried to tell myself it was just branches breaking or animals moving through the trees. It usually was. Around midnight, the rain turned into a full storm. The drops fell so hard that the ground around the tent vibrated. Water ran in thin streams down the sides of the clearing. I could feel some of it sliding under the tent floor. I pushed my backpack against one side to stop the sagging fabric from touching me. My heart kept beating faster than it should. My hands felt cold even inside the sleeping bag. Then something happened that didn't fit the pattern of the storm. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like a foot pressing into soaked soil. Slow, deep, controlled. The kind of step that wasn't made by a deer or a fox or anything light-footed. I froze instantly. I lay there, muscles locked, breath held in my chest. The rain was still loud, but I knew what I heard. It was close, maybe 10 meters away from the tent, maybe less. I kept listening for a long minute. My ears strained so hard they almost hurt. The storm swallowed most sounds, but underneath it, I sensed movement. A slow drag, maybe a shift of weight, like someone trying to walk without being noticed. I tried to breathe quietly. I tried to tell myself it was just wind knocking something loose or maybe a big branch falling. But branches don't take careful steps. I remembered that the riverbank below the clearing had soft mud. If someone walked there, the footsteps would sound deep. I pictured someone standing at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the tent, barely visible through the rain. The thought made my chest burn. Minutes passed. The storm kept pounding. I stayed completely still. I felt like if I even shifted my elbow, whatever was out there would hear it. My mind kept building images. Someone crouching behind a tree, someone standing with their head tilted, someone crawling up the mossy slope. I hated that I couldn't see anything. The tent walls felt too thin, too fragile, like one quick motion could tear them open. Something pressed on the ground near the tent. Not a step this time, more like a slow, cautious weight right at the edge. I felt the faintest tremor through the floor. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't the storm. It was too steady. My whole body tensed so hard that my legs started to shake. The sound stayed there for a long time, maybe half a minute. Then it faded. I couldn't tell if the person moved away or just shifted position. I waited. The rain kept falling. The wind pushed the tent again and again, but I didn't move. My breathing felt loud inside my own chest. Time lost meaning. Could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Eventually, exhaustion forced my body to move. I turned onto my side slowly, pulling the zipper of the sleeping bag just enough to feel like I could get out quickly if something happened. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. I kept watching the dim shape of the tent wall and listening to every shift in the storm. Around 4 in the morning, the rain softened. The wind died down. The forest became more still than before. I waited for the first bit of daylight to reach the clearing. When I finally unzipped the tent and crawled out, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with leftover moisture. My boots sank into soft mud. My breath came out in small clouds. The clearing looked normal at first.
Wet gras. Fallen needles.
A few broken branches. Then I saw them, fresh footprints near the mossy slope, leading from the direction of the river toward the clearing. They were deep, spaced in a slow walking pattern, and clearly made by a human. The mud still held their shape. The prints were not mine. They were larger, heavier, and the direction they faced was straight toward my tent. I followed them with my eyes. They stopped about 6 meters from where I slept. The last footprints faced my tent directly, and there were no prints leading away. The ground was muddy enough that any step should have left a mark. But whoever was there either stepped onto rocks or backtracked slowly through the same prints. I inspected the area carefully. I didn't find anything. No trash, no shoe piece, no sign of a camp or shelter. Just those prints facing my tent. I felt a slow wave of fear spread through my chest, heavier than what I felt during the night. Someone had been watching. Someone had moved quietly through a storm and stood within a few meters of my tent without making a mistake. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't make themselves known, didn't leave anything behind except the tracks. They didn't try to break in or harm me, but they approached in a way that felt deliberate, almost practiced. I packed my gear quickly. Every second felt like I was being watched again from the tree line. The air still felt heavier than normal. The mud clung to my boots. The wind stayed completely still, which made everything feel wrong. When I finally walked out of the clearing and made my way back to the dirt road where my car was parked, the forest remained silent behind me. I didn't look back once. When I reached the car, the windows were covered in beads of rain, and the doors were just as I left them. I threw my backpack in the back seat, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I reached the nearest village. Only then did the tension in my chest loosen enough for me to breathe normally. For days after I returned home, my mind kept circling those footprints. The slow steps, the way they stopped and faced the tent, the missing exit prints. I kept trying to explain it with something simple. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost, maybe someone passing through. But none of those explanations made sense. No normal person walks right up to a stranger's tent in the middle of a violent storm, stands there silently, and then disappears without leaving any trace of where they went next. In the end, I decided one thing clearly. I would never camp alone again. Not in Norway, not anywhere. The woods at night aren't dangerous because of animals or weather. They're dangerous because you never really know who else is out there, moving quietly, watching from a few meters away, waiting for a moment you won't notice until it's already passed. And sometimes the scariest part isn't what they do, it's what they choose not to do. I had always been drawn to the untamed parts of the world, places where civilization felt like a fragile illusion. In 2018, at 27, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the Amazon basin in northern Brazil. I wanted to camp in the heart of the jungle, far from the few tourist lodges that dotted the riverbanks. I had studied survival guides and learned enough Portuguese to get by, but nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. The day I arrived, the air was thick with humidity, and the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation clung to my clothes almost immediately. My guide, a wiry man named Raul, who knew the forest like the back of his hand, dropped me at a narrow, winding tributary far from any road or trail. He told me to follow the river for about an hour to reach a clearing suitable for camping. Raul left me with basic supplies: a small tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a machete, and a first aid kit. The forest was alive in ways I had only read about. Birds with shocking, vivid feathers darted overhead, their cries echoing through the canopy. Insects buzzed constantly, and the trees towered so high I couldn't see the tops. The sunlight barely penetrated the dense foliage. As I trudged along the muddy riverbank, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. I reminded myself that jaguars and large snakes often moved silently. My heart raced every time I heard the snapping of twigs, but I tried to stay calm and focused. By late afternoon, I found the clearing Raul had described. It was a small patch of dry earth surrounded by towering kapok and rubber trees. I set up my tent and stacked some firewood nearby. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the jungle floor like dark fingers. I ate a can of beans warmed over a small fire, listening to the cacophony of frogs and insects. Night in the Amazon was oppressive. The air became heavy and sticky, and every sound was amplified. Somewhere in the darkness, a river otter, or maybe a capybara, slid through the water, making the reeds shake. I zipped up my tent and tried to sleep, but sleep was difficult. The forest seemed to press against the thin fabric, and every crack or rustle set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I finally drifted into a light sleep. I woke hours later with a sharp, almost electric feeling of unease. Something wasn't right. My tent had shifted slightly in the mud, and the air smelled different, faintly like ammonia. I sat up slowly, listening. Then I saw it, a thick, dark shape sliding silently over the edge of my clearing, moving closer to my tent. My stomach dropped. It was a snake, enormous, at least 4 or 5 meters long. Its skin glistened in the weak moonlight, mottled brown and green, and its head was lifted slightly, tongue flicking in and out. I recognized it immediately from the survival guide, a green anaconda. I froze, remembering everything I had read. Green anacondas were non-venomous, but they were deadly constrictors. They could kill a human with sheer force. I had no way to scare it away without exposing myself, and my tent offered almost no protection. My first thought was to grab my machete, but even moving could provoke it. I watched, heart hammering, as the snake's body slid closer to my supplies, eyes fixed on the rustling bag of canned food. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears, and the faint squelch of the muddy ground beneath the snake's body. It was methodical, almost hypnotic in its movement. I remembered Raul's words, "Do not panic, do not run, do not try to touch it, wait until it moves on." But my mind raced. I needed a plan in case it came into the tent. I slowly unzipped the top flap of the tent just enough to peek out without fully exposing myself. The snake was now at the edge of the firelight. I had left a small cooking pot near the fire to boil water earlier, and I picked it up with a trembling hand. I tapped it lightly against a rock, making a loud, hollow clang. The snake paused, its head turning toward the sound. I froze, unsure if the noise had angered it or confused it. After a tense few seconds, it began to move again, slower now toward the river. My pulse was in my throat, and I realized I had been holding my breath for who knows how long. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I stayed upright in the tent, listening. Every splash, every rustle kept me alert. By dawn, the snake had vanished into the reeds along the riverbank. The morning sun brought some relief, but I couldn't shake the memory of those smooth, powerful coils sliding so close to where I had slept. I spent the next day cautiously moving along the river, checking my surroundings constantly. I made sure my supplies were secured in higher branches or tied to logs to prevent another encounter. Despite the scare, I couldn't leave the clearing entirely. It was beautiful in daylight, with small waterfalls feeding into the river and bright orchids clinging to tree trunks. But the tension never left me. On the third day, I decided to explore a narrow side stream. The water was shallow, clear, and surprisingly cold for the Amazon. I was fascinated by the variety of fish and the occasional flash of a caiman's tail in the deeper pools. That evening, I returned to the clearing, setting up my tent in the same spot. My nerves were still raw, but I was determined to finish the trip I had planned. That night, I kept a larger fire going and surrounded it with a ring of logs. I placed my cooking pot and a few stones around it to amplify noise in case anything approached. The forest seemed alive with energy, every sound magnified in the stillness of the night. Hours passed, and no snake came near. I realized slowly that staying calm, moving deliberately, and respecting the creatures around me had likely prevented another encounter. By the fourth morning, I was ready to leave. I had learned more about survival than I had anticipated. Not just how to cut through vegetation or boil water, but how to coexist with a forest that could kill you as easily as it could sustain you. When Raoul returned to take me back, I felt a strange mixture of relief and accomplishment. The jungle had tested me in ways I had not expected, and I had survived. Looking back now, I understand the clarity that fear can bring. When faced with a predator as powerful as a green anaconda, panic is deadly, and preparation is everything. I also learned to appreciate the delicate balance of life in the Amazon, the way predators and prey, humans and snakes, all share the same space. The memory of that night, lying in my tent while a massive snake glided inches away, remains vivid, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. I never saw another snake that close again, and I made it home safely. But I will never forget the hiss of its breath in the dark, the subtle shifting of its body, and the cold realization that in the Amazon, even the quietest sound can announce your presence to a creature capable of ending your life in an instant. That trip changed the way I see nature, danger, and the thin line that separates the two. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip into the northern wilderness of Montana. I was 32 at the time, and while I had hunted a few times with friends, I wanted to test myself alone this time, just me, my rifle, and the forest. I packed carefully, checked my gear 3 times, and left my small cabin in Bozeman early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind of sharp cold that wakes up your senses instantly. I drove my old pickup truck northwest, following winding roads that eventually dissolved into gravel, and then dirt paths that barely counted as trails. I reached the spot I had chosen just as the sun began to dip behind distant ridges. It was a remote clearing surrounded by dense pine and fir trees, with a small stream snaking through one side. Perfect for deer, or so I hoped. I parked, unloaded my pack, and began to set up my small, green canvas tent. My heart was buzzing with excitement and a slight tension that always comes when you're completely alone in the wild. By the time I finished setting up my camp, the sun had dropped completely, leaving a bruised purple sky. I made a small fire using dry twigs and some kindling I had brought. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The wind whispered through the treetops, and I could hear the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. I made myself a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the fire, ate slowly, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. I kept my rifle close just in case. I slept fitfully, waking at odd hours to the distant crack of branches, the snap of something heavy moving through the woods, and the low murmur of the stream. The next morning, I packed lightly and headed out into the forest. I was following deer tracks I had spotted near the stream. The ground was damp with last night's frost, and my boots left deep impressions in the soil. The forest was dense, almost claustrophobic at times, and I had to push through low-hanging branches. My rifle felt heavy on my shoulder, but I liked that weight. It reminded me that I was prepared. By late morning, I found signs of a buck. Broken twigs, shallow hoof marks in the mud, a few tufts of fur caught on low branches. I followed the trail carefully, moving slowly and trying to be as quiet as possible. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds or small animals were muted, as if the forest itself had gone on pause. I had a tight feeling in my chest, a mix of excitement and unease, but I told myself it was just the isolation. Around midday, I spotted the buck. It was grazing near a thicket, unaware of my presence. I crouched behind a tree, raised my rifle slowly, and took a steady breath. I aimed and fired. The shot echoed loudly through the trees, more than I expected. The buck bolted, but I saw it collapse a few meters away. I approached cautiously. My adrenaline was high, and my senses felt sharper than ever. I inspected my kill, satisfied with a clean shot. I prepared it for transport, dragging it carefully back toward camp. It was exhausting work, but I was used to physical strain. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was low again. I cleaned up, secured the deer, and started my fire. That night, I felt a strange tension in the air. I kept hearing noises, small at first like twigs snapping, but then heavier sounds. Thuds in the underbrush, something moving closer to my camp. I kept my rifle beside me, listening intently. My instincts told me this wasn't a deer or a small animal. The forest seemed to press in on me, and I realized I had no cell signal. I was completely alone, vulnerable. Hours passed. The noises continued intermittently, always at the edge of hearing. Every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. Every breeze sounded like something breathing. I tried to rationalize it. Deer moving, raccoons, maybe a bear scavenging. But then I heard it. A low, deliberate snap, like someone stepping on a branch very close. I froze. My heart was pounding in my ears. I thought about running, but I knew that moving blindly could make things worse. I gripped my rifle and slowly crawled to the edge of the clearing, staying low behind my tent. Through the fading light, I saw a dark figure moving among the trees. My first thought was a hunter, but this wasn't another person out for sport. The movements were deliberate, cautious, like someone stalking. My mind raced. I had packed bear spray, but it was in my backpack, not in my hand. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. The figure paused, glanced in my direction, and then melted back into the darkness. I waited, tense, until I was sure it wasn't coming back. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle, every whisper of wind set me on edge. I stayed awake, watching the perimeter of my camp, rifle ready. When dawn finally broke, I packed quickly. I decided to leave the area and head back down the mountain. I didn't want to encounter whatever had been there again. The walk down was long and exhausting, and I constantly scanned the woods for movement. Every snapping twig made my pulse spike. By the time I reached my truck, I was covered in sweat despite the cold. I loaded my gear quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees as I started the engine. The isolation of the forest had vanished in the harsh sunlight, replaced by the familiar sight of the dirt road winding back toward civilization. I drove slowly, still wary, until the first sign of another car or cabin appeared. Only then did I allow myself to exhale fully. Later, I learned from a local ranger that poaching and illegal hunting were not uncommon in that region. People often moved silently at night, taking what they wanted from the forest. I realized then that what I had experienced wasn't supernatural. It was human and far more dangerous. The thought that someone could have been watching me all night, waiting for an opportunity, made my skin crawl even days later. When I finally reached home in Bozeman, I unpacked my gear and checked the deer. I was exhausted but relieved. The forest had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I had survived, careful and alert. That trip changed the way I approached hunting, camping, and isolation. I no longer sought solitude for thrill alone. I respected the wilderness and the people who might move within it for their own reasons. From then on, every hunting trip I took included careful planning, extra precautions, and awareness of not just the animals but the humans who shared the same wild spaces. The memory of that night, walking back to my truck with every sense on high alert, remained vivid. I knew that being alone in the wilderness was a privilege, but also a risk. And that night in Montana, I had learned the hard way just how real that risk could be. It was the summer of 2018, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. I was 29 at the time, working long hours in a city job I didn't particularly love, and I just needed a break. The kind of break where no one could reach you, no phones, no responsibilities. I packed my old Jeep with a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, some canned food, water, and my hunting rifle. Not that I was planning to hunt anything, but for protection. The roads out there were rough, gravelly, twisting through dense pine forests, and after about 4 hours, I finally pulled off onto a barely marked dirt trail that led to a small clearing I had found on an old topographical map. The clearing was perfect. It was a flat patch of earth surrounded by thick pine and fir trees, tall and dense enough that the wind barely rustled the needles. A small creek ran a few hundred feet away, its water clear and cold. I parked, unloaded my gear, and spent the late afternoon setting up camp. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the rain fly was taut. Even though the forecast had been clear, I had learned to always prepare for sudden mountain storms. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping behind the ridges, and shadows were spilling across the forest floor. I built a small fire in a cleared circle of stones I found nearby, the smell of burning pine filling the air. I cooked a simple dinner of beans and canned chicken, and as I ate, I felt that first twinge of isolation that makes you hyper-aware of everything around you. The forest seemed alive, not in a mystical way, but in a very real, animalistic way. The creak of trees, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, the low croak of frogs from the creek. It all sounded unnervingly close. I decided to take a short walk before dark, following the creek upstream. The path was narrow, and in some places, I had to push past low-hanging branches. After about 15 minutes, I reached a point where the creek curved sharply and widened into a small pool. The water was almost black in the shade, reflecting the trees like a mirror. I crouched, splashing water on my face and taking a few gulps. That's when I noticed something odd. On the opposite bank, about 50 feet away, there was a trail of footprints in the mud. Large, heavy, and widely spaced, like someone or something had been walking along the creek. They were fresh, and they weren't human. The toes were long, the heel broad, almost like the tracks of a bear, but something about the stride didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too straight. A sudden rustling behind me made me spin around. Nothing. I was alone, obviously, just the wind in the trees, or so I told myself. I went back to camp quickly, keeping my rifle loosely in hand. That night, I made sure the fire burned longer, throwing extra wood on it, the sparks rising into the sky like tiny stars. I double-checked my tent, my gear, even the rifle. Sleep came slowly. Every sound in the woods felt amplified. The snapping of a branch made my heart jump. The hoot of an owl sounded closer than it should have. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a heavy thud outside my tent. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, listening. Another thud, then another, this time in a slow, irregular pattern, like something was deliberately walking around the perimeter of my camp. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, some other animal. But the thuds were too measured, too rhythmic, not the chaotic patter of an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slightly, peering out. The light caught movement, just shadows shifting between trees. My stomach sank as I realized something was circling the fire. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I also didn't want to provoke it. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, just stay calm." The fire was almost out, the embers glowing dimly. I grabbed a few logs and tossed them onto the coals, the sudden flare lighting up the clearing. That's when I saw it clearly. A figure, crouched low, moving slowly between the trees. Not running, not attacking, just observing. It was big, easily over 6 feet, but the thing that made my stomach twist was how silent it was. No rustle of branches, no cracking twigs. It was moving like the shadows themselves were bending. My mind screamed to grab the rifle, but I froze, staring, feeling every hair on my body stand on end. Hours seemed to stretch as I watched it circle, always keeping the trees between us, never stepping into the firelight. At dawn, when the sky began to pale, it vanished. I dared not sleep again, staying by the fire, scanning the forest. Around mid-morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up as quickly as possible, not caring if the tent or gear got dirty, and started hiking back toward the main road. The hike was tense. Every sound made me jump. I imagined the figure watching, following, waiting for me to make a mistake. The trail narrowed, twisted, and the forest seemed endless. About an hour from the clearing, I heard footsteps again, this time behind me. Not like the earlier thuds, but something lighter, faster. I spun around, but nothing was there. The hairs on my neck were prickling. I started jogging, then broke into a full sprint, slipping on loose rocks and roots, my lungs burning, my heart hammering. When I finally emerged onto the dirt road, I saw a truck parked halfway down the next bend. Relief hit me so hard it was almost nauseating. I ran toward it, waving my hands, screaming. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked startled, then quickly opened his door for me. I jumped in without even explaining. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely start my Jeep. Later, safely back in town, I reported the footprints to the local ranger station. They inspected the photos I had taken, measured the prints, and admitted they had no idea what could have made them. They called it an unidentified large animal. But privately, the ranger told me stories of people seeing figures in the bitterroots, shadowy shapes moving between trees, always silent, always watching. Most thought it was deer, elk, or bears. Some thought it was a person living off the grid. No one really knew. I never went back. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how alone and small you are when you're in the wilderness. But I also learned something important that trip: preparation, observation, and respect for the forest can save your life. I left all my gear in the Jeep the next day, sold the tent, and never camped alone in those mountains again. The story had a clear ending. I got out safely, unharmed, but the memory of those silent footsteps, circling, watching, still sends a shiver down my spine. Sometimes, even when you make all the right choices, nature or whatever lurks in it reminds you who's really in charge. It was the summer of 2019 when my wife, Jenna, suggested we take a weekend camping trip with her friend, Carla. We had all been stressed out from work. Jenna in marketing, Carla teaching high school, and me in construction. And the idea of getting away to the mountains seemed perfect. We decided on a small, relatively unknown campsite near Lake Harmony, up in the remote hills of Pennsylvania. I had never been there before, and neither had they, but that made it feel like an adventure. We drove in Carla's old Subaru, the three of us packed with sleeping bags, a small tent, cooking gear, and more food than any reasonable person could eat for 2 nights. The road wound up through dense forest, the trees so thick in some places that the sunlight barely reached the asphalt. The smell of pine and wet earth hit me immediately when we stepped out. I had been camping before, but something about this place felt different. More isolated, quieter, and at the same time heavier, like the forest itself was watching us. We picked a site that looked ideal. It was just off a narrow dirt road, a clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The lake wasn't far, just down a small slope, its surface calm and dark. I carried the tent, and Jenna and Carla unpacked the car, humming quietly to themselves. Setting up camp was easy at first. I pegged the tent, spread out the sleeping bags, and collected some firewood. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward us like fingers. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The birds stopped singing, the wind whispered through the treetops, and insects became louder, almost deafening. I started the fire, the flames snapping and crackling, and the three of us sat around it eating the first batch of food. Carla had brought sausages, Jenna brought sandwiches, and I had grabbed a pack of marshmallows for dessert. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake a small, nagging feeling in the back of my mind that we weren't as alone as we thought. It started around 10 o'clock. I had gone to refill the water jug at the lake, flashlight in hand. The path down was narrow, muddy from earlier rain, and the trees pressed close, blocking the moonlight. When I got to the lake, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud along the shore, barefoot, human, but too large to be ours. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't completely old either. I froze, listening. Nothing. No voices, no snapping branches, nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the shape of the footprints was wrong. They were too flat, too long, like someone had stretched their feet. I shook my head and went back to the tent, convincing myself I was just imagining things. Back at camp, Jenna and Carla were asleep. The fire had died down, leaving only a few embers glowing faintly. I decided to sit outside for a while, trying to calm the uneasy feeling in my chest. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling from the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then there was a snap, like a branch breaking under a heavy foot. I froze, staring into the dark forest. The rustling moved closer, slow and deliberate, until it stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but the hairs on my arms stood up. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. What if it wasn't friendly? I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it again, that the isolation and the strange footprints were messing with my head. Still, I felt eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I went back into the tent, shaking. I woke Jenna and Carla, whispering what I saw, but neither of them reacted much. They said it was probably a raccoon or a deer and tried to fall back asleep. I stayed awake, listening. Every little sound, the wind, an animal, or even a branch cracking, felt like someone was moving closer. Couldn't shake it. Around 2 in the morning, I finally heard it clearly. Footsteps, crunching leaves, moving slowly around the perimeter of our campsite. Not like a deer or raccoon. These were human footsteps, heavy, measured, and deliberate. I looked at Jenna and Carla, both still asleep, oblivious. I grabbed the baseball bat I had packed for protection, tiptoeing to the tent flap. Outside, the moonlight barely illuminated the clearing. The footprints I had seen earlier seemed to have returned, closer now, encircling the tent in a rough, uneven loop. Whoever or whatever had made them was still there. I didn't panic yet, but my heart was racing. I thought about calling 911, but there was barely any signal up here, and if someone was outside, the last thing I wanted was to announce my location. I decided to wait. I stayed perfectly still, listening, holding the bat tight. After what felt like hours, the steps stopped. Absolute silence fell. I stayed on edge until dawn, barely sleeping, half expecting someone to burst into the tent. When the sun finally started to rise, I crawled out of the tent to inspect the area. The footprints were gone. Nothing left but the normal tracks of animals and the damp forest floor. The strange, heavy, barefoot prints had vanished. It didn't make sense. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. Jenna and Carla woke soon after, groggy but cheerful, completely unaware of the night's terror. I didn't tell them everything, just said I had a bad dream. They laughed, still half asleep, and we started breakfast. The forest seemed friendly again in daylight, with birds singing and a gentle breeze moving through the trees. We packed up quickly, all of us a little quieter than usual, and headed back to the main road. On the drive home, I kept replaying the night in my head. Whoever had been out there had clearly been watching us, testing us, but for some reason they hadn't approached directly. The thought was chilling, but I was also oddly grateful that the encounter had ended without confrontation. That realization, that we had been completely at someone else's mercy, stuck with me long after we returned. Back at home, life slowly returned to normal. I kept a baseball bat by the front door for a while, and I never camped in a remote area again without doing thorough research first. I talked about the experience to a few friends, and they all suggested it was likely some local, perhaps a transient living in the woods, but that didn't make it any less real or frightening. Looking back, I still can't explain why we weren't discovered, why whoever it was didn't make contact. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were smarter than I imagined. The memory stayed with me, though. Every time I hear footsteps at night or see shadows moving through the trees, I remember that weekend at Lake Harmony, the strange footprints in the mud, the silent rustling just beyond the firelight, and the realization that sometimes danger isn't dramatic. It's quiet, patient, and watching. It taught me to respect the forest and to never take isolation lightly, even in what seemed like a simple weekend getaway. I had been planning this trip for months. In the summer of 2018, at the age of 26, I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Jura Mountains in eastern France. I wanted something quiet, something that would let me escape the constant noise of Paris. I drove a battered old Peugeot with a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food to last me a week. I had no plan beyond picking a spot and staying off the beaten path. That's how I ended up on a narrow dirt road, winding between dense pine and beech forests, the kind of road that seems to disappear into the mountains. I reached a small clearing just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The place was perfect. A flat patch of grass surrounded by trees, a small creek babbling nearby, and the faint smell of wet soil and pine needles in the air. I parked the car, unpacked my gear, and set up my tent. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional bird or rustle of leaves. As I worked, I noticed a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. It didn't seem like it had been used recently, but it was wide enough for someone to walk through without difficulty. I didn't think much of it at first. I set up my campfire, cooked some pasta over it, and settled in to watch the sky turn pink and purple. The air was cool and damp, the kind that clings to your skin. I lay on my sleeping mat, staring at the darkening trees, feeling the satisfaction of being completely alone. But as the last light faded, I heard a sound that made me sit up. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving along the edge of the clearing. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm was unmistakably human. Whoever it was, they weren't moving like a normal hiker. There was a weight to their steps, a kind of careful patience, like they were watching me. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the thickening darkness. Then I saw him, a figure standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree. He was tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothing that blended with the forest shadows. His posture was strange, rigid, almost like he was trying not to be noticed, but also daring me to see him. I couldn't make out his face, but I felt it staring at me. My stomach twisted, a cold knot forming. I tried to calm myself. Maybe he was just another camper, lost, or maybe he was a local out for an evening walk. But something about the way he moved, the way he stood, made every instinct in my body scream that I wasn't safe. I didn't dare get up or make noise. I told myself to wait, to watch, to figure out if he was leaving or not. Minutes passed. The footsteps circled the clearing. I could hear the crunch of leaves under boots, the snap of a twig. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he would hear it. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. I strained my ears, but the forest returned to its natural silence, as if nothing had happened. Couldn't sleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, fire dying down to glowing embers, ears pressed to the wind, eyes scanning every shadow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had imagined him, but deep down I knew I hadn't. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could. The sun was just rising, casting a cold, gray light through the mist that had rolled in overnight. I decided not to take the same trail back to the main road. Instead, I followed a narrow creek downstream, hoping it would lead me somewhere populated. Halfway along the creek, I spotted something that made my stomach sink. Footprints in the soft mud, large and deliberate, leading parallel to the creek. Someone had been walking near me, following my route, maybe all night. I froze, heart racing. The footprints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Whoever had made them had been here while I slept. Panic set in. I considered running, but I didn't know which direction was safe. The forest felt endless. Then I remembered my car, my only means of escape. I had left it at the clearing. I had to get back to it, but I didn't want to risk moving through open spaces where he might see me. I crouched behind trees, moving slowly, keeping low. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made me flinch. I reached the clearing by mid-morning. The car was still there. The tent had been disturbed, not destroyed, just rifled through. My gear was scattered, my backpack partially open. Whoever had been there had looked through everything. My heart sank deeper, but the car was locked, and there were no footprints leading directly to it from the trees, just the faint trail disappearing into the forest. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear into the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when I saw him again. Across the clearing, near the tree-line, the same figure was standing, watching me. He wasn't moving, not even breathing as far as I could tell. Just standing there, a shadow among shadows. I drove off slowly at first, not wanting to provoke him. Then I floored the accelerator, tires spinning on the dirt road. I didn't look back. For a long while, the road wound endlessly through trees and hills, and I kept expecting him to appear in the distance, stepping out from the forest like he had the night before. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about 20 kilometers away. I parked at a gas station, hands shaking, sweat running down my back despite the cool air. I called the local police and reported the incident. They told me they had received other reports of a man matching that description, often seen lurking near isolated campsites in the region. Apparently, he had been scaring solo campers for years, but no one had ever caught him. After that trip, I never went camping alone again. I couldn't shake the image of him standing in the shadows, his rigid posture, the silent patience in the way he watched. I kept my tent gear packed away, my backpack untouched, a constant reminder of how quickly the peace of the forest could turn into something terrifying. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. He could have done more than just watch. The isolation of the forest, the quiet of the night, the vulnerability of a single camper, all of it worked in his favor. I survived because of instinct, because I stayed calm enough to leave when I had the chance, and because the forest, in its randomness, gave me a path back to safety. That summer in the Jura Mountains changed the way I see solitude. I learned that sometimes the scariest thing isn't supernatural. It's real people and the unknown intentions behind their quiet actions. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that clearing, about the crunch of leaves behind me, and the feeling of being watched. It's a sharp, vivid memory that reminds me, you can never be too careful when you're alone, and the forest doesn't care who you are. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 28. I had decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. I needed to get away from the city, from the constant buzzing of life, from the endless emails and deadlines. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted quiet, some time to think, and maybe a couple of nights under the stars. I packed my old Subaru with a small tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, some canned food, and enough water for 3 days. I also brought my hunting knife, not because I was planning to hunt, but because it made me feel safer. The drive up the mountain road was long, twisting, and lined with dense pine forests. I passed only a few cars and didn't see anyone else until I reached the small dirt parking area near the trailhead. A faded sign warned of bears and cougars, but I wasn't worried. I had grown up in rural Montana and knew how to handle wildlife. I hiked in a few miles until I found a small clearing near a creek. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled faintly of wet moss. I set up my tent in a corner of the clearing, far enough from the water but close enough to hear the creek babbling. I stacked a small pile of firewood and started a fire as the sun sank behind the mountains. The first night was peaceful. The sky was clear, and stars blazed like diamonds overhead. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creek and the occasional rustle in the trees, and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, and my camera, and followed a narrow trail deeper into the forest. Birds sang, the wind whispered through the trees, and I felt completely alone in the world. About a mile down the trail, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed, like something had been dragged. I followed it carefully and saw a patch of flattened grass. At first, I thought maybe an animal had bedded down there, but then I noticed the pieces of torn clothing tangled in the branches. My stomach sank. I wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, but something about it made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I decided to turn back to camp, but as I retraced my steps, I started to hear snapping twigs behind me. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the steps were heavy, deliberate, and they weren't stopping. I picked up my pace, keeping my eyes on the trail, but I could hear it. Someone or something was following me. My heart began to race. I forced myself not to run, thinking maybe if I panicked, I'd make myself more vulnerable. By the time I got back to my clearing, the sky was gray and clouds had gathered. I quickly packed my firewood into the tent and zipped up the flap. I didn't light a fire, worried it might attract unwanted attention. I ate some canned beans and sat in the dim light, listening. The creek was still babbling, but the forest around me seemed unnaturally quiet, except for a faint, irregular snapping sound far off in the trees. I told myself it was probably another hiker or a bear moving through the underbrush, but the thought didn't make me feel any safer. The third day, I woke early to pack up. I had planned to hike out, but when I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something that froze me in place. Footprints. They weren't mine and they weren't animal prints. They were human, big, heavy boots. They circled my tent and then vanished into the trees. My stomach twisted, and I realized someone had been watching me while I slept. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my food and water inside, and grabbed my knife. I didn't make a fire. I didn't linger. I walked quickly toward the trail, every snap of a branch making me flinch. About an hour into the hike back, I saw something I'll never forget. A man, tall, thin, and wearing a dirty gray hoodie, stepped out from behind a tree. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. My heart jumped, and I froze. I considered running, but my legs felt like lead. He didn't move closer, but the look in his eyes was intense, empty, almost predatory. I fumbled for my phone, realizing I had almost no signal, but enough to send a text with my GPS location to a friend back in Missoula. My hands shook so badly I had trouble typing. The man finally turned and walked slowly into the forest, not running, not hurried, just walking. I didn't move until he disappeared from view. I didn't look back. I walked the rest of the trail as fast as I could, keeping my knife ready, listening for any sounds behind me. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, but I didn't see him again. By the time I reached the car, I was exhausted, shaking, and covered in sweat. I locked the doors and sat for a few minutes, trying to calm down before starting the drive back down the mountain road. On the way back, I called the local ranger station. They told me that, yes, there had been reports of a man living in the forest, someone who followed campers and hikers. No one knew exactly who he was or what he wanted. Some said he had attacked people before, but he'd always disappeared into the woods before authorities could catch him. They advised me to report what I saw and to stay on main roads. The drive back to Missoula felt unreal. The sun was setting, painting the mountains orange, and I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see him following me in a car or on a motorcycle. By the time I reached the city limits, I had started to calm down, but the fear lingered. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I double-checked locks, carried my knife everywhere, and avoided hiking alone. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. A few minutes later on the trail or a wrong turn into the woods, and I might not have made it out that day. The experience changed me. I still love the mountains, but I never go in alone. I always check in with someone, and I always keep an eye on my surroundings. What I learned that summer is simple but unforgettable. Nature is beautiful, yes, but the real danger doesn't always come from the animals or the elements. It can come from other humans, and there's no predicting their intentions. I still go camping, but I respect the forest in a way I didn't before. It's not just trees and streams. It's a place where you can be completely alone, and in that solitude, some people, some things can find you. Even now, I can still feel the weight of those eyes in the forest, the sound of snapping twigs behind me, the way my stomach twisted when I realized I wasn't alone. I'll never forget it, and I've never hiked in those parts of the Bitterroots alone again.